This presentation is on intercultural art education, cleaning up confusion. Some references that inspired this presentation are Melanie Davenport, Culture and Education, Polishing the Lenses, in Studies in Our Education. Roger Tomhave, Value Bases Underlying Concepts of Multicultural Education, in Studies in Art Education. Jean Blocker, Varieties of Multicultural Art Education. And Brian Hill, Faith in the Blackboard, Issues Facing Christian Teaching. There are three main models that are underneath the umbrella of intercultural art education. There's community-based, there's global, and multicultural. Another part of this presentation is going to be educational purposes. I believe these are necessary to help separate out these different models from one another. There would be cultural understanding, cultural appreciation, cultural acculturation, cultural assimilation, and cultural reconstruction. Another overlaying aspect to this presentation is teaching styles. There's going to be four, which will be discussed later: exclusive neutrality, exclusive partiality, neutral impartiality, and committed impartiality. The first model is going to be community-based education. Melanie Davenport said, "Some general educators addressing intercultural education issues believe, quote, cultural diversity in education must begin with schools and teachers acknowledging the cultural uniqueness of their own students and communities. The reality is that your students are diverse people. They're all different, and we should be teaching them and their needs. So, some have particular interests, some have particular cultural values, and in a culture that is diverse as ours, we do cross-pollinate our ideas to one another, but in that process, things can get lost over time. One good example would be the Native American community. Some have lost their entire language, their native language, and that's a sad thing. So, that's just one example of many. But if my classroom was all Native American students, and we believed that we wanted to hold the tradition or keep the tradition of their native language going, then we would want to integrate that into our classroom to keep it alive. Some art educators that are main researchers for community-based education is Christian Cogden and Doug Blandy. On a grid, on a continuum, you can see the three models. There's on the right, there's community-based education, a more conservative. Global is in the middle, and multiculturalism is more on the left. The continuum, when I say minority and majority, what that is meaning is that your classroom, let's say we're dealing with Native populations, Native American population. My classroom is 95% Native American population. And so I would look at that and I would be teaching them accordingly. And so I would like to do community-based education, and we want to hold on to our Native American roots and traditions. And so we're going to focus our curriculum focused on those community interests. And that's the majority of students in the classroom are that, and so we're going to focus on that. There could be a few who are not Native Americans, and they're the minority in that case. So the educational purpose is going to be cultural understanding of their tradition and their values in that community. The question is, does cultural understanding mean understanding my culture or someone else's culture? To clarify, it means our own culture. That students' own traditions. They're going to understand themselves better. It's much more self-absorbed. And there can be a problem with this. It's called cultural separatism. Tomhave gave this category, and he said, it entails separating a cultural population and often is seen as the development of a separate school by which traditions can be maintained from others. And there's a natural process of community-based education, I think, is what does this. So they're wanting to hold on and cling to their own value system and their culture, and in that way you can be separating yourselves from others. Uh, where it becomes different, it's not the same. Cultural separatism is not unanimous with community-based education. It only becomes separatism when you are not interested in learning about others, but you're only totally self-absorbed with self in your own value system. So that's just something to keep in mind. In that way, it can turn into a bit of a cultish if you go to extremes. The more positive direction in community-based or moving closer to global in the grid or continuum is going to be bicultural slash cross-cultural. The underlying value in the cross-cultural understanding approach is that without losing the ideal of achievement in the present democratic educational system, we can accommodate the concerns of various ethnic groups and also gain an appreciation, respect, and acceptance of diverse cultures' contributions to the human condition. I put this next on the grid, moving left, because they're still holding a certain value system, but looking outward, looking at others a little bit more. And so in this way, it's not only a cultural understanding, but it's starting to move to cultural appreciation. Global education. This type of intercultural education focuses on the socialization of students into international citizenry, or as a process of acquiring appreciation of human diversity in cultures and of the complexities of the international system. That's based on Davenport's statements. So what's interesting about global education is, and it's in the middle of the grid, the continuum, is it's going to be helping young people actually think about more like a dual citizenship. And I don't know how much we really do this in the United States. I mean, we have uh, by a dual language at times. We learn two different languages, but to truly be international. So if you could say, I can go to France and I could actually speak the language somewhat fluently. I know their history of France. I know their cultural ways, and that's very different than learning just a language or learning a little bit about a culture, but actually almost a dual citizen. That's the kind of high mark that global education is trying to achieve here. It's very challenging. What it actually does, and Tom Have gives these categories, he calls it acculturation slash assimilation. So generated for mainstreaming the other students into mainstream society, the goal is to develop a democratic society that could be governed by a majority vote of rational, enlightened citizenry who have equal access to achievement within society. So it's one thing to appreciate and another thing to understand, but it's another thing to be enculturated into it. Global education, actually, there's two main leaders, June King McPhee and Tom Anderson. I'm sure there's others, but that's just a few art educators' names. So in this direction, global education and cross-cultural education is its educational purposes are cultural understanding, for sure, cultural appreciation, appreciating others and other cultures. But taking a step further, you're starting to become enculturated into a dual citizenry and even moving into a cultural assimilation. But we need to look deeper into what is the difference between acculturation and assimilation. So again, on our continuum, we've moved to global education, which is in the middle, and now we're trying to separate assimilation and acculturation. And what does that mean? So acculturation, you could see it metaphorically as a salad bowl. having one's foreign culture added and mixed with that of his or her already existing one acquired since birth. So I am, say, a Hispanic born student. I come to the United States and I become acculturated into American society. And the difference in culturation, I love this metaphor of salad bowl because I'm in a salad. You have your different components. You have your tomato. You have your lettuce, different types of lettuce at that. You have some cheese, maybe a little pepper, some carrots, some croutons. See, all of those are their own thing. So this theoretical student who's Hispanic, he's always going to be Hispanic. He's always going to have that cultural tradition. But as he comes into the United States, there becomes a acculturation, a merger. We together we become a salad. But yet we still hold our integrity of what it means to be a tomato, what it means to be cheese, and what it means to be the lettuce. They're distinct things. Assimilation, the metaphor is a melting pot. Soup, in another way of looking at it. So minority groups are absorbed into a generally larger community. And so, we look at a soup, and you're going to have your salt and your pepper and your tomato sauce, and you're going to have cheese that melts in there, and possibly some other type of spices, and it's never going to be able to be pulled out again. You can't pull out salt, out of that soup once it's in there. You can't pull out the tomato, sauce and all this kind of stuff once it's in there. It becomes something new. It becomes a soup, a new product, and that's a true merger of this theoretical student, the Hispanic and American cultures become one, and they become fused together. So that's assimilation. There really are a difference between the two. And a little historical note, cultural assimilation in the United States. This comes from Gene Blocker. It says, quote, Anglo-Saxon was regarded as a superior race, not with Asian or African races, but with Irish, Italian, Slavic, and Jewish peoples. As of the early 20th century, these were considered separate races. Now all these are seen as one white race embodying one European culture. What's really interesting about that statement is the fact that today we definitely see movement in this cultural assimilation in the United States. In the past, they seem to separate themselves as I'm Irish, I'm Italian, I'm Jewish, I'm Slavic. We don't even see that today. They would just call that Caucasian whites. It's much, and now we're really even further fusing Hispanic and African and Asian and American and all these things together, where if you look at New York Times Magazine, maybe 5 years ago, they gave a digital composite of the new American, the new United States American citizen, and it is this combinational look between literal look between African American, between Hispanic and Caucasian white cultures. The third model is called multicultural education. And what it really is, Tom Have gives it a great statement as it's social reconstruction. And I know multiculturalism, that word has been thrown out there so much. It's synonymous with cultural education. And I think that's why I like the article that ultimately calls it intercultural education, and then there's these three subheadings underneath it. Multicultural education is social reconstruction, and if you're not doing that, then you really can't call it multicultural education. So multicultural education is concerned not only with ethnic and racial perspectives, but also with matters of Eurocentrism, sexism, and classicism. Socio-political change amounting to a restructuring of society is the goal and valued outcome of this approach. art education becomes subordinate to the goal of social change. I'll repeat that because it's a very important statement. Art education becomes subordinate to the goal of social change. This approach challenges social structural inequalities, promotes cultural diversity, and advocates that students take action against social structural inequalities. So, multicultural education, you're empowering the students to think about power dynamics, to think about race, and things like that, and for the betterment of the society. And ultimately, it's taking its influence from critical theory, pedagogical model. So, in this multicultural model, you do the goal is cultural understanding for sure, cultural appreciation for sure, and cultural acculturation and a cultural assimilation as best as we can happen and let it happen naturally, and cultural reconstruction. That would be all these are a high order. I mean, that's a lot to do, all these different goals, but that's ultimately what multiculturalism is trying to do. There's two main points to multicultural education, okay, objectives. It addresses the needs of students representing the minority cultures, okay, the minority, traditionally underserved by the educational system. And so you have the majority society. Let's just give an example. At large, you're, in the United States, the white Caucasian population is the majority, and I know that's going to be changing fairly recently in the next decade or so, but it still is the majority, and they still have the majority of power in the culture. So what multiculturalism is doing is trying to represent the minority. Let's just say African American community or Native American or gay and lesbian or something like that. Whatever it is a minority. The second goal, it works to foster tolerance and appreciation for diversity among all students, especially students representative of the dominant culture. So while you're trying to empower the minority, you're trying to help foster tolerance and appreciation for this minority group to and from the majority. So if I have I have a class of minority African American students, and I have some majority, cultural majority, the white Caucasian students. I'm going to help them appreciate and have tolerance for the African American society, while I bolster and encourage the African American minority group in the classroom. And there's two art educators that I would suggest. There's many more out there, but Patricia Stir historically has had a great impact, as well as Elizabeth Dela Cruz. Both have written extensively on multicultural art education. And so this is on the far left side. Again, you're trying to address the minority is the main focus goal, but you're also addressing the majority, and that you get them to appreciate the minority. And this is social reconstruction. Just for clarification, on both extreme bookends, you can do indoctrination. And you want to always be careful of indoctrinating your students on either extreme. It's very possible and it can happen, so we just need to be aware of it. So let's talk about teaching styles. Exclusive neutrality, exclusive partiality, neutral impartiality, and committed impartiality. The teacher can only have so many roles. You can do, you will do all of these in your career, and possibly a number of these daily. They're just different approaches. Exclusive neutrality. The teacher should not include and introduce topics that are controversial in the broader community. This view obligates the teacher to prevent discussion of topics of a sensitive nature. So there is a time and place when you avoid the topic. That's basically what exclusive neutrality is. You just don't talk about it. And I think there are some topics that are more controversial than others, and multiculturalism, for example, will go headlong into those areas when maybe global education or community-based education may not, depending. So there is appropriate time and place when you maybe you avoid that topic. For example, maybe it's not the right time to discuss that issue, or you just got to know the students in your classroom and you haven't created a rapport that it would be a disaster if you talked about that issue because they haven't developed a relationship that's strong enough of respect to be mature enough to deal with that issue. So that certainly is a relevant category, but most teachers don't avoid everything most of the time. The second category of teaching style is exclusive partiality. This view looks to a teacher's role as to lead the student into a preferable position, presented in a more authoritarian stance in the classroom. In a more subtle form of exclusive partiality, the teacher would encourage dialogue, but stack the deck in various ways. So, this is where you might continue at the bottom. It says teacher-directed learning and student-directed learning. And in this case, the exclusive partiality, you have a very strong leader as the teacher, and they see themselves as the authority. They're not a facilitator, they're the teacher. The student is going to be more of a passive learner, and at the very strongest of the student involvement, you're going to let them speak, but then you're going to be more devil's advocate. You're going to force them and force the direction of the content of the discussion to happen. Okay. The third category is neutral impartiality. So this position promotes an atmosphere where complex understanding, tolerance for ambiguity, and responsiveness to constructive criticism are given opportunity to all students. The teacher, though, in this style remains silent about their topical views. Okay, so ultimately, you're trying to create discussion and discourse, and students are taking a strong leadership role. But the teacher avoids giving their personal opinion. Now, the teacher can do devil's advocate and say, well, what do you think of that? Or what's that thought? Or Johnny, what do you think of this? And Susie, it doesn't sound like you agree. And you're facilitating for sure to create discussion, but you do not share your personal opinion. There's a place for that. At times, the teacher may be too strong or of a character in the classroom, and so the student, as soon as you say your opinion, you will sway the entire class. And that's not what you want in that case. Maybe you want to let yourself not be that kind of strong influence, but you let the students critically think for themselves. The fourth category is committed impartiality. So committed impartiality has two components. Teachers should state their views on issues and should allow competing perspectives to get fair hearing through critical discourse. Committed impartiality views teachers as collegial mentor, personal witness, and democratic authority. Okay, so this is, again, you are creating discussion, creating discourse, but you are allowed as the teacher to give your opinion. You're equal with everybody else. And the students see it that way. You've placed yourself in a position where you say, look, I need you to think for yourself on this issue, and I'm just similar to I'm just like one of you. I'm one of the gang. You could physically be sitting down instead of standing up. I mean, that certainly creates a position where you're not so much of a leader, but you're an equal when you sit down in a chair like every other student. Okay. Okay, so these are ultimately these categories for intercultural education. We went through community-based, global, and multicultural, and we did cultural separatism. Moving further to the left, you got cross-cultural. Then you move into more of a global direction where you assimilate students, and then you got acculturation. and in social reconstruction. Again, for clarification, you can indoctrinate students on both extremes, and it's possible to happen. And here's your references again. I would strongly recommend anybody reading Melanie Davenport's Culture and Education.